So in this section of the course, we're going to be talking about Azure Batch Service. Now, Azure Batch Service, as the name implies, allows you to upload batch jobs into the cloud and have Azure manage the execution. Now, a batch job is basically any job that needs to be rerun 1,000 times, 100,000 times, millions of times on different pieces of data. This could be examples such as simulations, weather predictions, rendering of a movie, etc. So anytime you've got lots of identical tasks that can be run in parallel, then you can consider building it as a batch job. And Microsoft will manage creating the virtual machines and managing the tens and hundreds of thousands of virtual machines required to execute them. So instead of having a single virtual machine that takes 48 hours to do a simulation and render a result, well, then you can use an Azure Batch Service, have that done in parallel, and perhaps in an hour to have the answer instead. Now, Batch Service requires a batch account. So in this video, we're going to create our first account that we're going to then use to log in to the Azure Batch Service. This is separate than your Azure subscription. Now, it chose my subscription by default and put me into a resource group. I'm going to let it stay in that resource group. We do have to give it a name, and see here that the name is fully qualified, including the region. And so this name has to be unique across this region within Azure. So I'm going to call this AZSJD Batch. Hopefully no one's taken that. Now, instead of running this in East Asia, which I'm going to scroll down here, we can see that it's identifying it here. Let's choose something a bit closer to us. So I'm going to choose East US. Okay, right there in the United States. Now, specify an optional storage account. For best performance, we recommend a storage account, a general purpose V2, located in the same region as the batch account. So let us go through that process of selecting a storage account. Now, I do have my Cloud Shell storage, but I'm going to create a brand new storage account. I'm going to call it Batch Storage. And it's a general purpose V2 it asked for, so I'll create that. And I'll create standard performance, and we don't need storage redundancy, so LRS for this account. So we have our new batch account running in our subscription and a resource group. We've given it a name, picked a location, and it's going to create a storage account for us. Okay. Continuing on to the next screen, we do have a way of allocating the pool. Okay. So whether the batch service manages the allocation of all those nodes, or whether it's going to be in our subscription, that's a decision that needs to be made. We're going to leave the default here. Tags, just like creating a virtual machine, we won't set up tags. And now we can review the batch account. So we're signing up for batch service. It's going to create a storage account for us. I'm going to click create, and then I'll have a batch account that I can start to use. So this is our Azure batch account. It got created in the region that we created it. We have a URL that represents our batch account. And to me, this looks a lot like a virtual machine. We've got the overview screen, tells us a bit about it. And if we were to minimize this or scroll down, we can see some monitoring graphs right on the overview. Now, of course, the monitoring for the batch service is different than the monitoring for a virtual machine. So we're going to see tasks, nodes, failed tasks, and the minutes that it's consumed. These are more in line with what you care about when you're talking about running batch jobs. Okay, let's open this back up, and we're going to go into the quick start section. And we could, obviously download PowerShell to be able to do stuff like that. I want to look at some sample code, because as developers, looking at sample code is sort of one of the easiest way to try to understand what's going on. When you click the sample code from within that batch service, it takes you to GitHub. No surprise, the Azure Samples user has Azure Batch Samples repository. And so we can see, I'm going to scroll down so we can see the README file, that there are languages for .NET, Python, Java, Node.js. And it tells you a little bit about the prerequisites. You're going to need a batch account. You're going to probably want to use Azure Storage to be able to see inside of those of your storage account in order to upload the files and jobs that are needed. Batch Explorer will tell you in a visual way how your batch jobs are running. And Batch does support Docker, and so there's a separate area to go if you want to look at batch support for Docker. We just want to dip our toe into a little bit of code here. So I'm going to go into the C# directory. And again, this is a number of sample code that we can start to look at and play with. It's going to tell you Visual Studio is required, and it's going to basically build the samples by getting the dependencies, etc. How you configure your credentials. There's a configuration method. Tells you more about the samples. Now I want to get into the getting started one because that's the obvious place to start, and we're going to get into Hello World. I mean, Hello World is an obvious first program you're going to run when any type of new programming situation. So here's a Hello World file. We could obviously clone this, download the code, load this into Visual Studio, compile it, etc. I'm going to go into the program.cs, and we can see here that it's a very short program. There's only 160 lines of code. If we look at the public class program and the main method, which is what starts up when the program runs, it really just sets itself up and runs this hello world in an asynchronous fashion using the wait method, which basically fires it off and it just goes into a wait state waiting for it to finish. Okay. The hello world task, the asynchronous function that gets called, does some basic command, console write lines when it starts, gets the credentials for the batch account. So remember, we created a batch URL, got a batch name. There's going to be a key associated with that as well. And then it's going to basically open up the batch client. It's going to create a job called Hello World Job. And it's going to submit what it wants to run and then await for the job to complete. So it's a very simple controller, basically, is what it is. Orchestrator. And so this is the job, submit job async. Coming down to submit job async method, creates the job, and it's going to create a pool. So we basically have to create the app world pool, get the configuration settings for that. We have virtual machine size that we want, the operating system, number of nodes, etc. That's all in the configuration file, which we'll see in a second. And the core of it here is that it's basically running a batch job that says, basically command line job that runs the echo command that just says hello world from the batch hello world sample. So each of the virtual machines, when we look at the target nodes and stuff like that, is going to basically run this command. It's going to just basically echo back a hello. And that's the purpose of Hello World anyways. So that's pretty much how you interact with a batch job using code. So go into GitHub, find this repository under Azure Samples User and the Azure Batch Samples repository. You can fork this or clone it and basically start from there in terms of starting to interact with batch. There's a number of samples. We just looked at the whole hello world. If we want to do something more than just say hello, the next one up is this pools and resource files. You can certainly read through this README. It does a little bit more than the hello world sample. And number 3 extends from that. So we're getting sort of a gradual increase in the complexity. So go check out those samples. It's an easy way to get started with the Azure Batch.